Now, we've been discussing the heart of a mentor and have realized that biblical leadership is based upon Jesus' upside-down kingdom. He modeled how different leadership was to be from the institutions in which we as the church, the people of God, are embedded. So this is a hard transformation issue for all Christian leaders, and all of us actually. Otherwise, we tend to gravitate towards power-based, ego-driven leadership rather than servant leadership. But what does servant leadership really look like in practical terms in our lives and organizations? This is the topic of this episode.
Welcome to Leadership Matters with Dr. Phil. His podcast discusses matters of leadership that really matter. Phil has had the privilege of mentoring leaders and coaching ministry teams around the world for several decades, and he's really looking forward to sharing with you some of the principles that have been so helpful for others. Leadership is about serving others, not power or position. Regardless of our context, family, job, ministry, or any circle of influence, we all have the potential to be this kind of leader. A foundational leadership skill that is often overlooked is mentoring intelligence. This series is based on the materials Phil has developed over a lifetime and taught in a variety of cultural contexts. To access all of our podcasts as well as our bonus leadership resources, just click the links in the description below or go to icmcanada.org/leadershipmatters or icmcanada.org/mentoring-intelligence. So now, let's join Phil as he discusses some leadership matters.
Now, before we get too deep into the episode, I'd like to just encourage you to take advantage of the free assessments we have provided. These are tools to help you reflect on your own life, as well as spark a discussion with someone that you are mentoring or being mentored by. You know, the servant leadership assessment uses questions to get at the heart of what we've been talking about over the last couple episodes. And there are two assessments. One is for you as an individual and helps you discover what your current mentoring quotient is. But don't worry, wherever you're at, we're always growing, so this is a learned skill. There's also a mentoring assessment for organizations, which addresses the need to change our ministry wineskins if we're going to create environments conducive to mentoring types of relationships. You might want to use this with your team. To download them, just use the link in the description box, and I hope you will find them helpful for you and your team members. Okay, so we've been talking about the lofty kingdom values of this upside-down leadership that Jesus was teaching, but what does this really look like in our everyday life and ministry? As I mentioned before, not too many people are going to argue against the concept of servant leadership or mentoring, but walking it out is where it gets difficult for most of us. Yet without some practical application, the danger is that it'll just be some theoretical truth we agree with. What does it really look like? My list here is not exhaustive, but I'd like to share 5 leadership characteristics that I believe need to be evident in a mentor's life if they're going to be effective. As we saw last time, Jesus' model of leadership had little to do with title and position, right? Kingdom leadership is about relationship, not position. The reality is that we can use our gifts and callings to influence others to see them succeed even beyond us. We don't have to be the cork in the bottle, so to speak. It's about developing others, not creating a hierarchy where we're in control. And as I mentioned last time, top-down leadership, with its focus on power and control, eventually implodes on itself. At the end of the day, people don't want to be controlled. People want to be developed and released, fulfill their potential. You know, big surprise. That is why it has a short shelf life. People may celebrate the strong man or woman in the beginning. Remember, we want a king like the other nations, but eventually this gets old because it becomes all about the leader serving themselves and increasing, not decreasing so that others may increase. It kind of just wears people out. As this relates to mentoring, instead of being threatened or jealous, mentors should celebrate the mentoree's success. Now, just a quick side note, I use the word mentoree, not mentee, for no deep theological reason. I just like the way it sounds and have used it for over 25 years. Of course, you can use whatever you like, protege, mentoree, or mentee, whatever the case. But whatever it is, our goal is to flatten the learning curve of the person we are mentoring, so that they will not have to make all the same mistakes we did. Remember, we have to make our own mistakes, all of us do, but none of us have enough life, not even 100 years, even if we live 100 years, to make all the mistakes possible. This is why we need mentors who have walked ahead of us and can show us some of the way. The goal is to help those we mentor mature in less time than it took us. Often, though, existing leaders have the mentality, hey, it took me 20 years to get here. By golly, it's going to take you at least that long to get where I'm at. And I'll make sure of it. For you armchair golfers out there, let me use a golfing analogy. For example, we talk about going to school on someone else's putt. You know, the path of their ball is close to mine, and so they're ahead of me as they're going to take their shot. And so I get behind them. Now, I don't recommend getting in front of them, but you get behind them to see how their ball reacts to the slope, you know, the grain of the grass, and so on. It's called going to school on their putt. I like that. In life, I'm always looking for those I can go to school on. Those who are ahead of me in some area of life or ministry. You know, clearly power-based leaders are too threatened to open their lives for others to learn from, which is why it is unlikely that they'll mentor anyone. Why would they want to allow you to go to school on their life? They want to keep that a secret so that either they can continue to impress you or maybe kind of keep you in your place. You know, another second characteristic of mentors is a willingness to open doors for others, not closing them. Mentoring is all about releasing, not controlling other people. However, if we have the wrong understanding of leadership, we'll feel threatened in our position, and so we'll fight to keep it. Kind of like the children, you know, playing King of the Hill in the schoolyard. But a pyramid structure of leadership fosters this type of attitude. These type of leaders have never allowed the Lord to speak to them personally of their pride, their ego, their ambition. And like I mentioned, they're not the type of person that I want to be mentored by. I don't know about you. A servant leader, though, never has to fight, you know, in their own wisdom and strength to keep what God has given them. You know, the reality is that someone can take your position, they can take your church, they can take your organization, but it's impossible for them to take your ministry or your influence. Once we realize this, we don't have to fight to keep our position or place in the body. Now, full disclosure, I still have what we call printed business cards. You know, for some of you may not have seen these. This is kind of a leftover from the 20th century. But on my card here, it states organization, it states my position, my title, my name. You know, it's very impressive. President, you know, oh wow, even PhD here behind my name. Very impressive stuff. I'm sure you're impressed. Now, every morning when I wake up and try to figure out what I should do for the day, do I have to refer to this card? You know, get out of bed, look at it, read, my title. Oh, yeah, I'm president. Oh, and I'm a doctor. I mean, you know, I should do something today that's befitting a president and a doctor. Is that how it works? No, not really. Actually, I don't even know where these are usually anymore. I don't need them or use them. But either case, the card is just a reflection of what I do, not a driver or a motivator of what I do. You know, if we get position and function backwards, we'll expend lots of energy and fight to keep our position. But as I said, someone can wrestle the organization and even my title from me. Trust me, in the past it's tried, and I've got a few scars to prove it. But what would I do the next morning? The reality is, I would get up and do the same thing I've always done. Write, teach, invest in others. See, because I don't need a position or a title to do that. That's kind of who I am. That's my gifting. You know, so people can take our church or organization, our titles, but they can never take away your God-given ministry. And once you come to terms with this and realize this, you'll never have to feel threatened. You'll never have to fight to keep what God has given you. Because you know, if this door closes, another one will open with your giftings and your callings. What this also means is holding the trappings of leadership rather loosely. You know, if we hold them too tightly, we will likely hinder the development of the next generation rather than releasing them. You know, this is particularly true as we age and we fear maybe becoming obsolete and irrelevant. You know, how many leaders do you know who out of fear are not letting go? You know, if we mentor others throughout our lifetime and release them, as with my discussion regarding true authority, we'll never run out of meaningful function. even if we no longer have a title or a business card. It's not dependent on that. That should all be kind of irrelevant for the ministry that God's given us and what we're actually doing our function. A third characteristic of a mentor is being willing to be vulnerable as we authentically live out our lives and minister to others. Last episode we went into great detail on this point, but just a reminder here. Paul taught us in Philippians 2 to follow Jesus' example and take on the nature of a servant. Peter followed this up by teaching us that it is our responsibility to humble ourselves. We must step off the throne. Even if others are chanting, "We want a king like the other nations." Jesus' impressive authority was equally balanced by his impressive vulnerability. It's interesting that it is said of Jesus that he made himself of no reputation. He was not too concerned about what others thought of him. If you missed the last episode on this topic, it might be worth going back and listening to it. I'm not sure about you, but I need to almost daily be reminded of this. That old fallen man keeps raising his proud, wizened head. I don't want to make it sound like it's easy to pull this off. It's not. But as we saw last time, without Christ living, it is impossible, without his help. And we may need to fight this battle regardless between this old and new man like Paul talked about for the rest of our lives. I probably should also mention at this point that this type of leadership is pretty risky. You don't have to look any further than what happened to Jesus. Betrayed by a close confidant, misunderstood, his reputation in tatters. Oh yeah, and then he dies a humiliating death by his enemies on a cross. None of that sounds like fun or particularly grand leadership activities, does it? Yes, it's a risk to step off the podium and take up our cross, particularly dying to our own ego and pride. But that's exactly what Jesus is asking us to do, to join him in doing. But I would suggest that the flip side is also true. It is a real risk to our physical and emotional health and spirituality to hide who we are behind achievements, titles, positions, and even pseudo-spirituality. See, in that scenario, we have to hide our faults, pretend who we are, hide our weakness, even our failures, living a rather artificial existence. And because we were never meant to live like that, it actually falls apart. In time, the cracks show. And if we have not humbled ourselves, others, circumstances, or even our own weaknesses will do the job for us. And my experience is that that's usually a lot more painful. Not allowing others to put us on a pedestal, though, saves us from a spectacular fall someday.
Listeners of our Leadership Matters podcast have exclusive access to our free bonus leadership materials, which include our MQ assessments as well as his Developing Others workshop. Just click the link in the description or go to our website, icmcanada.org/mentoring-intelligence. If you would like to take a deeper dive into this topic, click on the link in the description box where you can download Phil's Mentoring Intelligence book and the workbook. In it, he discusses the key factors that affect our mentoring intelligence and then offers a practical mentoring model which leaders have been using for decades around the world. The Mentoring Through Intentional Relationship Guides are a practical model to actually help you mentor someone. They are available in several languages and over the years have been used by thousands of leaders. The content, discussion questions, and other tools are designed to assist you in mentoring a potential leader and are available at icmcanada.org/resources.
The danger for many leaders, and actually all of us, is to avoid accountability at all costs. You see, it is accountability with others that will keep our feet firmly tethered to reality so that we can focus on people, not our position or our accomplishments. It is accountability that will help us stay vulnerable and authentic. Bobby Clinton's classic leadership study years ago indicated that 70% of leaders do not finish the race well, do not finish their lives successfully. This race of life is a marathon, not a sprint. I think I've mentioned in the past that when I started out, I thought it was more of a sprint. I was 17 when I went to college, and man, was I going to change the world. Well, most of my 20s were spent on the proverbial shelf. I had no training. I had all the training, I said, was ready to go, but God seemed to forget where I was. And for the record, his school is much tougher than any school I'd been through, academic school. I was ready to change the world and make my mark for God, but he was more interested in changing me. And this did not happen on a sandy beach, but exiled to do construction, mostly in the rain on the West Coast. Oh yes, and sprinkled with a generous dose of personal tragedies. If you're interested, you can read some of those stories in our book, Roads Less Traveled, on the website. I'm sure, like me, you have also noticed that life is more of a marathon. Everyone starts the race, but not everyone finishes it with their faith and sanity intact. That is why we have to be willing to enroll in God's school. The curriculum is tailor-made for each one of us. It is there where he forms us into the person who has the character that can handle our giftings and authority without spiritually abusing others or making it all about us. And as we discussed last time, authority in the kingdom does not make us aloof or distant from others, but rather willing to lay our lives down for others as Jesus modeled for us. That takes more than gifting. That takes character, which takes a lifetime to develop. But God is more concerned with who I become than what I can ever do for him. But to develop accountable relationships, we have to be intentional. They just don't happen because we get out of bed in the morning. The wise leader will not wait until the waters of crisis are upon them before developing such relationships. Now, this takes more than just being part of a small group that talks about sports or news of the day or even theology for that matter. As me, I'm sure you know leaders who have fallen morally or in some other way, and yet many of them we discover were even part of a small group. How in the world can that be? Like learning to preach without walking the walk during the week, it's easy to get proficient at looking accountable, but not really being open to others speaking into our lives and allowing them to really hold us accountable. Like, do you have someone besides your spouse who can ask you the tough questions? If not, you're kind of really on dangerous ground as a person and as a leader. I have a few guys in my life who I've given permission to ask me the tough questions of even my personal life. While this is not always comfortable, the alternative is much more dangerous. We're all imperfect, so we may as well own it. Accept God's grace and the grace of a few trusted others. This is a safety for me, and I would encourage you to cultivate this safety net in your life. It is the only way to finish the race well. A couple of years ago, I wrote a personal study on finishing the race, and if you would like to go there and look through it, you can download it from our website. You can also check out that podcast series as it's available. But are you fostering accountable relationships in your life as a preventative measure for yourself as well as for those you lead? Remember, it's too late to dig a well once you start to feel thirsty. And a fifth and final characteristic that we're going to look at this time is also something we touched about last time a little bit, but let me expound a little bit. This has to do with developing others versus just trying to gather a greater following for ourselves. And this is what I've always found interesting about Jesus' ministry. He only had a short time, about 3 years, but instead of focusing on developing a following or gathering crowds, he took a very unconventional approach to leadership. In John chapter 6, we see Jesus feeding the 5,000. And the food was so good, apparently, that they wanted to make him king on the spot. I wonder how many of us would have willingly consented. Perfect timing, right? There's a crowd, they want us, But as was his habit, Jesus quickly disappeared into the mountains by himself. And later on that night, he walks across the lake only for the crowd to follow him the next day. And in John chapter 6, verse 26, John tells us that really all they were after was the free food. That's what Jesus said. He says, you guys are just after the free food, not in relationship with me. He saw right through their motivations, didn't he? He then continues by explaining that he is the bread of life, and then ending with a rather cryptic verse 51, "This bread is my flesh, which I give for the life of the world." Of course, this started a firestorm of arguments by the Jewish leaders. In classic fashion, though, Jesus, instead of trying to clear things up, settle things down, he makes it worse by saying, "Verily, truly, I say unto you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." I'm sure at this point, Peter was doing the first century equivalent of rolling his eyes. Like, really, Jesus? Are we going to go there? How are we going to keep a movement going if you keep driving people away? Don't you know the first thing about marketing and creating a movement 101? I'm sure I would have been chiming in with Peter. Sure enough, the inevitable happened in verse 60. On hearing it, the Bible says, many of his disciples said, "This is a hard teaching, who can accept it?" But again, instead of clearing things up and, saying, "Hey, it's not so bad, guys, I didn't really mean that." No, Jesus doubles down in the next few verses, seemingly making things worse. In verse 66, from this time on, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. Now, these were followers, not just fringe bystanders. It says they were disciples. But then he turns to the 12 and he asks them, "Well, you guys, are you going to go like some of these other disciples?" Of course, Peter, likely still a bit shaken himself from the turn of events, offers a less than ringing endorsement. "Lord," he says, "to whom shall we go?" Thanks, Peter. Lots of help. Interesting response from Jesus, though. "Yes, I have chosen you." But he seems to be saying, but don't get too full of yourself. After all, one of you is a devil. Throughout his ministry, there were times when it looked like Jesus could capitalize on his popularity to really become a person of influence. For the good of the kingdom, of course. Instead, over and over, he not only does not seize the moment, but he actually seems to work counter to becoming the Messiah that we hope he is going to become. Jesus was never enamored by the crowds, was he? He was the opposite of a codependent leader. I would suggest that his focus was on developing leaders, the disciples, never focused on gathering a following. Kind of a lousy short-term plan, actually, but a great long game. And in the kingdom, successful leadership is measured by how many we develop, how many others we develop, not how many followers we may have at any given time. This is usually something every pastor has to remind themselves of every Sunday morning, in the aftermath, every Monday morning, I should say, in the aftermath of Sunday. The application to our own ministries is painfully obvious, isn't it? How much time do we invest in developing others versus how much time do we spend trying to have a bigger ministry? Of course, we rationalize that it's all for the kingdom. We need to get the message out after all, right? The world needs the good news. But Jesus never seemed too concerned about the timetable on that. He always went deeper before he went wider. Imagine what the church would be like today, worldwide, if we were more like this. So there you have it. 5 characteristics of a mentor, all based on kingdom values. So with this foundation, next time we want to begin to drill down into the actual mentoring process, which will occupy most of our remaining episodes. I'm really looking forward to it, and as always, I hope you'll join me. But before then, I'd like to leave you a few leadership matters to consider. In your role as a leader, do you release ministry or try to keep others under your control? How does your approach affect your ability to mentor? Do you have authentic, accountable relationships? Is there someone, besides your spouse, to whom you can be completely honest and knows how you are personally doing? Is most of your time spent developing others or building a bigger ministry, gathering followers, or investing in the non-urgent task of mentoring others? How would your priorities and values need to change to follow Jesus' model?
Thank you for listening to Leadership Matters. If this has been helpful, please remember to like, subscribe, and share us. Doing this will enable others to benefit from this material as well. If you would like to partner with us to provide these materials to leaders who cannot afford them, please go to icmcanada.org/donation.